Vincent's his writing career spans nearly 60 years. It includes poetry, short stories, novels, biographies, anthologies, criticism. He's won countless awards. He was Poet Laureate from 2013 to 2015. Today we're here to talk about his novel, All This by Chance, and some other things. We had another wonderful session yesterday at the Bell Tower talking about some other things, but All This by Chance, it's a remarkable book. It was just released in March, and we are incredibly lucky to have someone like Vincent here in Marlborough to talk to us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in welcoming Vincent?
Thank you.
Vincent, as I say, in a career that spans 60 years, this is only your third novel, which might surprise a few people, and it's your first novel in 20 years. Where have novels fitted in to your writing career?
Well, spasmodically, as you can say, but yes, I don't think of myself sort of in terms of being a poet or a short story writer or whatever, but rather as a writer, so that, simply writing whatever happens to have your attention at the time is the important thing, rather than thinking, oh gosh, only 2 novels, and if I'd worked harder I might have 3 or something. Yeah. So it's not an issue, and it would be if I wasn't doing anything else in between.
But there's been a lot of in between, hasn't there?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, Nicholas Reed, in reviewing it, said it's such a compellingly written and accomplished piece of work that it's surprising he's not written more often in this form. Looking back on your career, do you think, maybe I wish I might have written more? Or
No. Looking back, it's not a matter of writing more. I wish I'd written less when I pick up some of the books I've done.
We talked about that yesterday, and I might just get you to repeat one little story. Vincent doesn't look back on his early poetry with great fondness, unfortunately. There's a couple of collections at the start, and can you just briefly retell that story of a poor student and a suggestion that you came up with, how she might earn more money?
Oh, yes. Well, she's a student I probably owe more to than any other I ever knew. There was this very smart but really sort of hard-up girl about when I was still at Victoria. This must be 30 years ago, and she was saying she couldn't get a holiday job and it was very difficult for her to get fees and so on. So I'd once written an awful book of poetry called Revenants, and but it doesn't matter how awful a book is, it will get into a New Zealand library. And so I said I'd give her $10 for every copy she could bring to me, and that's why you can't find it in any library. But I told that to a librarian once, who was horrified, of course, as you can imagine, but I did everyone else a good turn.
All This by Chance, and look, I appreciate that some of you won't have read it, and it's very briefly, it's a novel that spans about 3 generations of a family, crosses the globe. We go from 1947 England through to 2004, I think, and back in Europe, and then at the very end it goes back to 1938 in Germany. It reads like a book that might have taken a wee while to write, Vincent. Is that correct?
Yes, it's difficult to know what is the average time that you should put into a novel, but it didn't take, I mean, in the 20 years between that and my last novel, it certainly wasn't there. It was really just in the last few years. And I started it as a short story, I think about 4 years ago, and then more or less forgot about it, and came on it again a couple of years ago and thought, oh, well, I'll expand that and go on with a bit.
Where did the spark come for that short story?
For the short story, it was about a time when I was living in Athens, and so that chapter sort of, in a sense, came first.
Right. There's a Jewish theme threaded through it, obviously, because it involves events that happened during the war, and the families, one side of the family has a Jewish heritage. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you came to tread in that world?
Yes, I'm very aware that it was a tricky area for a writer to take on. I was very disappointed that the publisher used the word Holocaust on the cover. I wouldn't presume for a minute to try and write about sort of the Holocaust in a serious or proprietorial way, because I've got no right to. And as well as that, there have been simply dozens, hundreds of interesting and good bits of fiction written about the Holocaust by Jewish people particularly, and so on. So that was the biggest challenge in doing the book. I knew the story had to take in certain events or certain periods and characters with connections with the Holocaust, but the way I regard it is what I'm dealing with are just 4 or 5 characters, New Zealanders, who are also Jewish. And so it was not saying or claiming to say anything larger about history than just look at the experience of these few people. But it also seems to me that as long as there is one Jew in New Zealand, the Holocaust is also a New Zealand story. You can't get away from it. But I hated the idea as if I was trying to, take on board a historical experience that racially and every other way I've got no right to claim. So that, in fact, is the reason why there's one scene, there has to be one scene, which is in Ravensbrück, the women's camp. But you see that through, and it has to be seen through the eye of a prisoner, but the character who tells that is actually a Jehovah's Witness, because the Jehovah's Witnesses were given a very bad time by the Nazis, and I didn't know much about them before I started doing this book, and finished up with an enormous respect for them, that they were the only women in the camp, and it was similarly in the men's camps, who could have walked out just like that. All they had to do was go and sign a bit of paper to say that they didn't regard Hitler as Antichrist, and not one woman left the camp, of hundreds there. And many died sort of in the way you expect in the camps and so on, simply because of this principle they had. And they were greatly respected and admired by the other inmates in the camps. They were incorruptible. And so that's why I thought, if I use this, at least I can say, well, yes, you say, what right have I got to write about a Jehovah's Witness? But it didn't seem quite appropriating in the same way it would have been to pretend I was looking at something from a Jewish mind. So that was, I suppose, technically the most and emotionally the most important decision I made was that, and it let me off the hook, frankly, of anyone coming along and saying, what right have you got to be talking about this?
People has anyone come
Oh,
forward
yes,
and said
there
that?
has been one review that really had me on about this. One review said it's not Jewish enough, and another said it's too Jewish. So,
and some people have said you've got no right as a non-Jew to be writing about this?
No, they haven't quite, they haven't put it like that. But that was clearly the implication, and I can quite understand that point of view, but I really did sort of try and take care to avoid that particular charge.
Right. When you were growing up, there was a Jewish family in your street. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I suppose that's what's set off. I mean, it's not in my initial interest, put it that way. Yes, when I was a kid growing up in Westmere, where those streets, those early scenes, the Auckland scenes are set, there was a Jewish family who lived at the end of the road. They were very quiet, didn't have much to do with any other neighbours. And as a young boy, I found this sort of fascinating in the way anyone very strange who's a neighbour fascinates you more than anyone else does. And I don't know what became of them, but there was an old lady in the house, from an 8-year-old or whatever it was point of view, an attractive girl of about 12. And And they always stuck in my mind as being not typical of our street. And they got on with everybody, and the neighbours all talked and that sort of thing, but there was a sort of a reservation about them. And I suppose that beginning with the story and setting it in that street where the family lives and so on, goes back to that. But that is merely almost incidental, because I'm not trying to talk about that family. I don't know about that family. All I know is their name. I've got no idea what became of them. But I suppose that spark of interest was there. And then, of course, a bit later, when you found out all the dreadful things that were coming out after the war, just at the stage just before I went to school and so on, but you'd see them in the newspapers and hear growing up sort of talking about the revelations of the camps and so on. Naturally, that fascination became even more when you thought, why would it happen to those people and not to the rest of us? And it was all sort of that muddled, childish thinking, which had gone underground for a very long time, and until finally I started writing this.
Now, you mentioned in thinking about all this, there's a poem that you thought you might read now.
Oh, yes, this is just before I started writing the novel, and it's just a little poem, but it's about a very touching anecdote I read in a biography of a Hungarian Jewish writer. And in the big march that everyone knows about at the end of the war, when they were just marching people from the camps and so on, he tells the story of when they were marching along and they were passing a compound that was full of circus animals who'd been impounded, and these animals started going through their tricks, and so when they saw people passing and putting their paws through and so on. And he said there was a sense of almost, not identification, but a sort of some kind of rapport between the animals and these people being on the death marches, which always stuck in my mind as what a vivid image that is. So this is a short poem, so it's called Road from the Camp. A story here I wish I hadn't heard. A row of prisoners stitched with yellow stars marching a summer road, oddly surprised to pass a compound lined with circus bears, with creatures of diverse and mottled kind, remnants from simple entertainments lost. Both sides look up, confused. The memories stir. The bears perform their stunts for favours tossed once their way by children, parents, scraps for begging paws. Those mime displays 100 years back, was it? Thinking how they and these once met in civil ways. This is the story of the final show, the trawl of stars from village and from city. The bears withdraw their paws, conclude their dance, watching the humans pass with almost pity.
Thanks, Vincent. The book spans the world, or a lot of it anyway. Auckland, London, Greece, Germany and Poland. You've lived in many of these places and presumably were able to draw from your experiences. You went to Greece at one stage in the 60s, wasn't it, to live, but that was curtailed.
Yes, that was the year of the revolution. So after the coup of the colonels, you could only renew your permit twice. So that meant after 6 months you simply had to get out. So otherwise I'd have had intended staying on there. But so it was a remarkably interesting time to be there. But there was no question of being allowed to, go beyond your 6 months.
So your glorious Mediterranean experience and tan that might have resulted...
Well, I never quite had the torso for those dreams.
The one place that you hadn't lived that does form one of the sort of chapters in this book is Africa. So how did you write that without having experienced it?
Well, there's a lovely sentence of Catherine Mansfield's when she said, we writers tell the truth as only the liar can. So it was a matter of trying to sort of pull the wool. I'm in a way sorry you mentioned that, because it was the one bit where I had to couldn't draw on actual experience of what things smelled like and so on. So you're dependent then on research, and a lot of people would say, well, you shouldn't write about a place you haven't been to, but I had no choice in that case. And
but you have it's it's set in a mission in Africa.
Yeah.
And someone did come up to you afterwards who'd been on a similar mission and said how authentic it was. So you must have done pretty well.
Yes, and asked me which mission it was, so I was called out. So, yeah.
Did you, I mean, just diverting briefly, because you have lived many places overseas throughout your career on fellowships and various other times, and this book is a truly international one in the respect of how many countries that it's set in. Have you ever considered leaving New Zealand for good and being a writer based somewhere else?
No. For better or worse, if you're born a New Zealander, you stay a New Zealander, it seems to me. And I mean, I've got a very good friend, probably my closest friend, who's been in Paris for 50 years. And, most people think he was French. But he says in himself, he knows all the time, he's a bit of a fraud if people think he's taken for a local and so on. And many people don't think that way. There's no reason why they should. But just personally, I feel if a place you come from, in a way, it shapes you in a way we can't do much about the colour of our eyes, the height we are, and sort of that's what we're born with and stuck with. And in spite of all the reservations you might have about the country you're in, as far as I'm concerned anyway, that is where your emotional centre lies. And unless you're driven by something that erases that or is stronger, it makes sense to stay there.
Plenty of New Zealanders and artists have gone overseas. Catherine Mansfield, who you've written extensively about, she did that though, didn't she?
Oh, but yes, but I mean she had to. She went, remember, in 1907 or 8, and it's inconceivable to think she might have stayed here. But now people have that choice, and more and more New Zealand artists and writers are, interestingly, drawn particularly to Germany. There are quite a lot of New Zealand artists and so on in Berlin. And that's absolutely fine. I think each person just decides for themselves, but as far as I was concerned, it wasn't really a contest.
It's a much smaller world now, and it's much easier to travel,
Sure.
and the characters in your book do travel. Now, one of the characters is the granddaughter of the characters that this story starts with. You had a reading, Vincent, that you were...
Oh, yes. This is when the gist of it's not giving the story away, but what you need to know is that this is the granddaughter of a New Zealander who just after the war, a young man who wasn't in the army but had gone to England after the war, had married a young woman who seemed English, but in fact she was like those Kindertransport children. And quite a number of those children who went from Germany to England weren't placed with Jewish families, were brought up by, and this girl was brought up by a Quaker family, and her Jewishness meant nothing to her. And it was only when they suddenly had to look after an aunt who was Polish, German-speaking, and so on, they realised there was this whole background they had to bring to New Zealand with them. And then gradually the family's influenced by this in various ways. And this is the granddaughter going back to what was Breslau and is now Roslav, trying to sort of see what does it mean to go back to where my grandparents came from.
And just explain where Breslau is,
yes.
and it's how it's changed countries.
Yes, Breslau used to be Germany, and Hitler called it Fortress Breslau because if Breslau fell, the whole of Germany would go. And then after the war, with the redefining of boundaries, it became part of Poland, and is now Wrocław. And so that's why it's this curious hybrid place where the architecture, the churches, all sorts of things are so German and Baroque, and yet it's intensely Polish as well at the moment. I shouldn't say at the moment, it just is. But, and it's caught up, of course, in these various debates going on in Poland at the moment. And this girl, she's in her 20s, she goes and finds the synagogue, which, curiously enough, it's one of the few synagogues that are still standing in this part of Europe, one called the White Stork, where the Jews of Breslau, who were incredibly cultivated people, they were German-speaking, many of them brought up speaking Yiddish, but they were German-speaking, very well educated, and in fact, Wrocław University has got, I think, 9 Nobel Prizes, and 7 of them were won by Jews, which, of course, the city is naturally very proud of, but it's interesting that they were German-speaking Jews who got them, including, a particularly interesting story, I think, is the man who invented chlorine gas for the Germans in the First War was a Jew, and his wife, who was also a very eminent chemist, committed suicide the first week the gas was used in the war. So, you know, it's an example of that extraordinary complexity the minute you start scratching the surface about anything in Europe. But anyway, this is when the girl goes to the synagogue, and in the courtyard there is where they were herded together before they left. And of course, the thing about many of the Breslau Jews, they just couldn't believe. Many of them were, most of them were still practicing their faith, but they couldn't believe that as cultivated Germans, anything could really happen to them. And so she walks out again into the open air, to the walls rising on 3 sides of her, the lift of the synagogue across from where she stands. It no longer bothers her, the confusion of one imagined building in mind, the reality of another in front of her. Her accepting, she thinks, that is what must define me. The mess of it all is what I am. To be here now, in the square of the courtyard that struck her as so like the bottom of a well, rising several stories to that other square of now sharp blue sky. Where they had been instructed to assemble, those who in absurd optimism and incomprehension still remained in the city to be rounded up. She looks at the overlap of one cobblestone against another, the window ledges exactly as they must have seen them, the rise of the flat pillars against the painted wall. They, the family, their hands holding, touching, comforting. She supposes, or perhaps not. She had read how the older ones at times like this, the devout, the ones with certainty of more than fear, already would be moving their lips, speaking the words louder even than that, and the guards amused at their presumption, the joke that prayer might slow so much as a child's shuffle on the march that would soon begin to the rail lines and the station. Once the timetables were set in stone, Esther's own lips now move as she says their names: Chaim, Elizabeth, Sarah, Hannah, Ephraim. She closes her eyes, leans her head back against the wall. She says them over again. There is nothing more she can do, the closest she will ever be to them. Yet to say so much as was is surely to say it in the present. The past is here or not at all.
Thanks, Vincent. I mean, it's remarkable that the kind of crossover between that passage and this story with Diana Witchell. I don't know if some of you have attended Diana's sessions here, and again the stories of how Diana's family were taken to extermination camps, and her father escaped, etc. So you've been to Breslau, haven't you?
Yes, yeah.
And as you say, it's a remarkable place. But I mean, how did it strike you? How much of that history still resonates around that area?
Well, I think, for one thing, there's the number of Jews in Wrocław had run to a couple of hundred, probably. The big liberal synagogue was naturally destroyed with all the others. This one was actually one of the more conservative ones, and I've no idea why it survived. And there are a small number of people still go to that. I had the good luck of writing ahead and arranging to meet someone who might explain something of the Jewish history of the city and so on. And that person couldn't be there that day, and there was a rabbi instead, a rabbi who'd spent quite a number of years in America, and he took their place, and he was rather aggressive at first. He asked a perfectly reasonable question. He said, "What do you want from us?" And which isn't a good way to begin with someone you're hoping can. But after a while, he couldn't have been more helpful, and even sort of took me into they don't use the big part of the synagogue now, but a smaller room where he took out the scrolls and chanted some of it for me so I'd know what it was like, and so on. And so I felt rather privileged that he'd done this, but you could tell that he was uneasy as a Jew still in Poland. Not that there is any distinction anyway, sort of politically, but it's just in the air, I think. But then I might be being unfair to Polish people saying that. And so I think what you'd say is that for some people it's still important, for others it's the past, and it simply doesn't matter. But he found it, the rabbi found it extremely odd that someone from New Zealand, and said a very curious thing. He said, "But isn't sort of New Zealand like Ireland?" He said, "The countries that treat Jews well." Isn't that a curious thing to say? And I felt almost on the point of saying, well, there were never many there to be a problem, but of course didn't. Yeah.
While you visited the city, you didn't visit the camp that you write about, did you?
No, I didn't want to.
And can you explain a bit about your thoughts on that?
Well, there's an extraordinary book came out a couple of years ago called "If This Is a Woman" by Anne Helm, which is an 800-page, very grueling book about the history of Ravensbourg, which was the women's camp. And if you read that, anything you want to know or need to know is there. And I had been, like lots of New Zealanders travelling, I'd been to Dakar and so on. But I thought, I don't want to get caught in that trap of what I call necro-tourism, of where if you've been to one camp, what can you possibly get by going to 2 or 3 or 5? You've been to a place where atrocities happened, you pick up in the most trivial way, finally, the enormity of what took place for people. And beyond that, it becomes, just in my view anyway, unless you're a Jewish person, it becomes a sort of voyeurism. And so there was no need to go there and to say, oh, well, I know exactly where the train lines were or something. So what? I didn't need to know that. So that was just my view about visiting places that carry this enormous historical burden of violence and so on that you can do nothing about, so don't feed off it.
One of the major themes in this book, and it's been a theme in a lot of your writing, is about families and the relations between children and their parents, and in this case, the grandchildren as well. And the title of your book is All This by Chance. I mean, families are the ultimate all this by chance. You never get to choose them, do you?
No. That's why I've no idea what the title means, actually. Because everything that happens in your own life, you can argue, oh, this is chance it's happening now. It was chance that I met my wife, or it's a chance I got run over or something. But at the same time, there's always more to the story. Or you can say, well, there's one chance sets off another chance. But if you believe that, you're then talking about fate and so on. In other words, it doesn't pay to think about it too much.
How's chance treated you in your life, Vincent?
Well, it's got a bit to answer for, I think.
But there have been extraordinarily good bits, haven't there? It's
Yeah.
been a fortunate career from a literary perspective.
Yes, and mine was an extraordinarily fortunate generation. Those of us who were born just before or during the war or just afterwards. That was maybe not economically, that came later, the favoured generations, but we were the privileged ones, that we were between wars, we had the benefits of, free education and all these sort of things. So I would think that many of us in the room have been treated well by chance of being born in New Zealand at that time.
Indeed. Another theme that runs throughout the book is secrets, if you like. Things that have happened in the past and that the next generation might know about, but often doesn't know about. Are some things better left unrevealed and not shared with children?
Again, everyone has his or her own idea about that. I don't believe that personally. I don't think you should necessarily tell children that their grandfather did time for getting close to a housemaid or something. There are some family stories you don't, although if that happened to me, I'd love to know. But whether we like it or not, we're also shaped by secrets. And often the way we're treated, or an attitude, you think of your own childhood, you think of some attitude your parent suddenly says, no, that's not on, and it surprises you because it's not what you expect. And somewhere behind that there's a story you never know, why that particular attitude was shaped as it was. And so you can't get far in fiction of any kind without coming across things that some people know about and others don't. And so secrets are I think the wellspring that drives fiction.
But I mean, in real life anyway, we dig too deeply into our family history, and perhaps there are things that we'd rather we didn't discover and know.
I suppose so, yeah. I get a bit sceptical sometimes of people who are going into their history, family history, desperately hoping they're going to be the Duke in secret or something, And people can be so boring about their ancestors, can't they? And they're never as interesting to anyone else as they are to yourself. But that doesn't alter the fact that it's interesting to know about certain aspects of your family that often someone's dead and you find out something about them, or you find out something that would have influenced them, and so on. And for example, I had an uncle who, or at least a removed one, who committed suicide in Wellington because he was a homosexual, and this was found out in the 1930s. And I didn't ever hear that from my parents. I heard it from other relatives after they were dead. And I think every family has something like that. And the good thing about secrets, I think, is that after a time, none of them are very shameful. But they become more interesting.
There's a wonderful line in the book, the past like an avalanche, the past always waiting to happen.
Yes.
And I guess increasingly people are, as you say, searching out to find out about their past and their genealogy, and people now taking DNA tests to
That's
find
right,
out.
yes.
You've had was it Helen, your wife, has had one of those, hasn't she?
Yes.
And what did she find out?
Well, she had a grandmother who was adopted, and then found out that she was an Ashkenazi Jew. And I had a far more unfortunate experience. I was desperately hoping that, there'd be something interesting in my DNA, and it came out 97% Irish. So, so if you can live with a disappointment like that.
I just quickly on that point, you told me a really interesting story the other day about that, because your family, you come over here, O'Sullivan, your Catholic family.
Yeah.
Tell me about your uncle and about how he adapted things.
Yes. Well, my uncle's son's in the audience, so I'll have to be careful about this. No, I was just trying to explain how, with quite a lot of Irish families, you're Sullivan or O'Sullivan, or you're Donoghue or O'Donoghue, and how this has absolutely no resonance at all for us now. But if you go back a couple of generations, it involves you in sort of a number of highly emotional situations. Yeah.
And what happened with your family?
Yeah.
One of your uncle changed his name,
yes,
essentially.
But it made absolutely no difference in the relationship in the family.
Yeah.
But I think it was, perhaps for business reasons or something. And of course, in Ireland itself, it's almost used indiscriminately. Whether
he dropped the O, didn't he?
Yeah.
He became.
But
Sullivan
in Ireland, they
instead of
often
O'Sullivan.
don't use it anyway.
Yeah.
So it's really not a significant issue now, although it was
At that time.
Yeah, 100 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Just talking about secrets, though. I mean, are there secrets or not secrets? Are there things in your past that you have chosen not to share with your children? Or would most?
I was going to say my school C results.
I mean, if they asked, would you always be up front? Or like Stephen, one of the main characters in all this by chance, would you choose not to reveal everything?
I think anyone who says I can reveal anything at all about my life either isn't telling the truth or is a very dull person. I think everyone has secrets, or not even secrets, but those you think of dreadful moments of embarrassment and so on. Everyone has those, so there's no such thing as a life without secrets. For example, there's still a secret in this book that whether you get it or not, you can read the book and not get it, but it explains. I've put it there as a secret.
I didn't get it. You had to explain it to me.
Oh, no,
that says a lot about me, isn't
it? Actually why Eva does commit suicide. Yeah.
And that's Eva is the character who was sent from Germany to England, raised by a Catholic family, Quaker family, and was only later revealed her Jewish background.
What I meant by that, Mike, was not that I was playing a game and hiding a secret, not at all. What I meant, there is a secret there that she knows, but the rest of her family never know.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that secret kind of, and the story behind her suicide, it just off on a quick tangent, because I think we've got the John Mulgan book here. You did a biography of John Mulgan, one of New Zealand's most famous authors. There's always been a bit of an uncertainty and unknown and secrets about how he committed, or why he committed suicide, isn't it? Did you, when you were researching it, ever get to the bottom of that?
No, and not entirely. I just very much dislike biographies if they're dealing with someone who took their own life, who speculate. You've got no right to speculate on a suicide. All you can do is, if there's hard evidence there, if there's a note that says, it was, I couldn't pay the mortgage or something, that's fine. But with Mulgan, there are still areas that aren't altogether clear. And yet there was even, in fact, just a couple of years ago, someone's trying to resurrect a story that was around at the end of the war, that Mulgan didn't commit suicide, but it was the Greek underground resistance that set up the suicide to look like that and so on. But that's been well and truly gone over, and there's no truth of that at all. But he left rather ambiguous notes when he died, and so you can't say he was these days he'd be called a depressive, I think, or at least bipolar, but they didn't even have the word for it in the 30s when he was a young man. Just before he died, he had malaria, and the treatment that was given, the drug that was used at that time, they found out later was a depressive. He was politically enormously disappointed. He wrote to his father just a couple of weeks before he died. He said, we had so much buoyant hope as young men in the 30s. but he said now it's the same old men will be doing the same old things. Being in Greece, he was very close to the resistance and had fought with them during the war, and then suddenly Churchill comes in and says, no, these are the communists, we are now fighting them. So he'd lost faith in British politics as well. He didn't really want to come back to his wife. So there are half a dozen things there that you might think one of them might have been enough for some temperament, but for Mulligan's, which was very complex indeed, all these things you have to acknowledge as possibilities, but you've got no right at all to say this is why. We just have to believe him. He says, there's a very curious thing he says in a letter to his commanding officer at the end, that I'd have had myself decently killed in battle, with the resistance, but that's not the way an officer should behave. So that shows he was already thinking of it. Yeah. And in fact, it was the day after he posted his copy of Report on Experience, posted that to his wife. He'd got his last bit of writing out of the way, and so he was free to kill himself.
Vincent, there's a lovely passage in the book, which a story that I'd never heard about when someone dies in the family, telling the bees about this. Would you like to read that passage?
Yes,
for us?
I'm interested to know how many of you sort of have come across that it was in England and perhaps other parts of the UK, I don't know, of telling the bees when someone dies. Many of you?
Few people
Yeah,
have,
some of you.
yeah.
We hardly hear of it now, do we? But it was really quite a widespread thing that if in particularly Cornwall, I know it was definitely there because I've read about it there, that if someone died and you were on a farm or you're a beekeeper, you had to tell the bees about the death of someone they knew, because otherwise they'd get very uneasy and the hives would get upset. So someone was always sort of commissioned to go off and say to the hives that so-and-so's died. And that went on right until the early, into the 1900s. And obviously it never happened in New Zealand, because I've never heard of it in New Zealand, have you? But if you speak to people, say, whose grandparents might have been in East Anglia or something, they'll say, oh yes, I think I have heard about that. And so I was using that notion of quite simply Esther, the same girl who went to the synagogue. She goes to visit the relative of the Jehovah's Witness woman, because she and the Jewish grandmother were very close in the camp together and had both been in Auckland and so on, but don't worry about all that. And when she's on this farm, she meets this young chap, Milan, who's an English Czech fellow who's working in the Blue Mountains as his OE, and he tells her about this strange nephew of the Jehovah's Witness woman going to tell the bees about the death, because the old lady had been living on the farm. And without sort of trying to make too much of it, it's meant to be sort of one of those sort of moments you can't explain rationally, but not going so far as pretending it's a mystical moment or so, but just a strange occurrence when something in the air changes. So in a sense it gives Esther freedom even hearing about it. But anyway, I'll just read that bit. Sorry. And so Milan described for her as they sat in the darkening room, the unsettling vividness as she imagined it, the tall man and the burring hives, and the grey and dappled barrier of the bush in front of him, the glare of his shirt and what seemed the afternoon's hot, empty pause. He had now removed his hat and placed it on one of the iron spikes that supported the wire-stranded fence, where he crouched for a moment, lit a match which he placed against what seemed, from where Milan sat, a kind of small funnelled can, and that the man then held as he approached one of the hives and took a covering board from the top, which he laid on the ground. Already there was the rising blur of the smoked bees darting, flickering, as if the weave of a fiercely thickening veil, through which the man now knelt on one knee to put his hand into the hive's lower level on its shallow platform. Milan watched in his ignorance what seemed both methodical and crazed. The man standing again and placing what the farmhand only later learned was the queen against his forehead, her hive responding in a gusted whirl about the solid figure, and the man speaking as if addressing them. There was a sense almost of reverence in the way he stood stock still with his hands now held in front of him, the way you see men standing at the side of a grave. The strange, stalling formality of that, as the dark, fluent stain, as it seemed, on the shoulder of his shirt swelled, the bees compacting and spreading down his sleeve and across his back. Milan, standing now on the veranda and appalled, compelled by what he witnessed, the blurred, seething fabric of the air, and heard the sound like some distant, implacable machinery, is the only thought that came to him, a mad enough thought in itself. That man is dressed in bees. It is his sound as well as theirs. And then the man stooped again and rebuilt the stories of the hive, and it was as if an apparition had been withdrawn, the extraordinariness of what he witnessed remaining with him still, an occurrence seemingly cut off from any notion of time. For he had no idea of how long all this had taken, or how brief it may have been. It was something discrete, entire, apart from anything else he knew or might imagine. He did not expect anyone to believe it was quite as he had said, a standing, living pillar that was both calm and fury, and then later the man walking back across the paddock, the burr of the bees behind him, returning and settling to their hive. Esther, imagining it so vividly, its strangeness excited her, the seeping across the man's back like a frothing lung, and yet the stillness somehow of it too, even beautiful to think of, even that, the making and unpicking of a living shroud. She said, "I don't know if I can take it in, make sense of it," as if another story went on within it that eluded her, an awful exhilaration as she thought of it. And then, oh, to hell with it, she said, laughing, not wanting to laugh. She took Milan's hand from her knee and knelt on the warm leather of the couch and moved towards him, coming to get him. God, she thought, if only it wasn't words we have to work through all the time. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt and touched the warmth of his throat. "Fucking bees," she said, pressing her mouth against his ear. And that's the beginning of the love story.
Thanks, Vincent. There's no beekeepers or apiarists in the audience, are there? I think it'll be a fabulous ritual to kind of keep going, whatever it means and whatever with the reality of it. The dedication in this book to Fiona, tell us who that is and what's behind that.
Oh, well, there's nothing much behind it. It's just that's Fiona Kidman, the writer, who's a good friend of mine, and a person I admire for her fiction, but also it's nice to have the chance to say I admire her so much. I can't think of any other New Zealand writer who's done as much for writers not only serving on committees on Creative New Zealand and that sort of thing, but in sort of a quiet way, helping younger writers and so on. And it was just a way of sort of saying thank you to her for what she's done for writers. Yeah.
The reviews of All This By Chance have been pretty amazing. A couple of them have mentioned that it requires close concentration. How difficult is it to kind of tread that line between, as a poet, and writing how you want, and yet making it accessible, if you like, to an audience. How much thinking goes into that?
Yeah, well, I think it's accessible enough as a story.
Yeah. Oh, incredibly so.
And so on. I suppose the thing that disappoints me a bit, and it may be my fault in the telling of it, is that whenever people or reviewers, they get onto the Jewish aspect, where there's other aspects of it that interest me. Yeah. There's two very nasty young New Zealanders in it, or one particularly, one called Fergus, and so on, who was involved with one of the family. But he and the girl he takes up with, another New Zealander in Italy, make me think so much of New Zealanders I've known, at least of my generation, some time back, who were spectacularly awful people, I think. And they regarded life as, nothing wrong for regarding life as an adventure, but that life was there as a spectacle for them, and they were to be part of it, and they had absolutely, and I hope it doesn't make me sound like a preacher, but they had sort of no moral compass about anything as long as things were going good at a certain time. And so they'd go to Athens, and then they'd go on to Rome, and they'd finish up in Budapest, and, so on. And life was just as moving from place to place, having a good time, and somehow we're special and don't have to accept responsibilities for other places or people because we're New Zealanders. Have you known people like that? Yeah. Well, perhaps I'm the only one I have and they don't exist. But so I was trying to get sort of something of that kind of character as about how New Zealanders can, on occasion, sort of cut a swathe of moral chaos through a place, and without being too heavy about it or anything. But they were also, as you can imagine, good fun to write about, and could say all sorts of things. If I said in private life, you'd think, what a dreadful person. But, I mean...
That's the joy of being a novelist, isn't
exactly.
it, Vincent?
You've got a mouthpiece for your inner self.
Yeah. And this character, Fergus, who we'll say less than pleasant in many ways, can you just tell us what your wife uncharitably said about?
Yes, she said, there's no need for you to ever write an autobiography. Yeah, but you mustn't ever quote her.
Oh, no, it doesn't go out of this room, okay? Look, Spin-Off labelled it, all this by chance, as the best New Zealand novel of 2018, and Nicholas Reid on Stuff said it is as outstanding a novel as has been produced in this country in the last 10 years. That's high praise, nice praise. How much do you read reviews and how much weight do you give to them? I suppose you give them plenty of weight when they're good.
Yes, yeah. I don't believe writers who say they don't care about reviews, but it is possible. I do believe writers when they say, but they don't make too much difference once you've got over either the pleasantness of a good review or the irritation of a not appreciative review. So in other words, yes, of course they matter, but they matter primarily, when the chips are down, they matter primarily because they affect sales. And I remember an editor of the Listener, or at least an editor, told me once years ago that, I don't know if it's the same now, this must be 20 years, the difference between a good and a bad review in the Listener could be the difference of 8 to 10,000 sales.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Because you see, if you can imagine somebody who lives at Pakipaki or somewhere like that, they get the Listener, it's the only place they will ever see a serious review. And if they're people who like reading, and they will naturally think, oh, that one book interests me, or that one doesn't. They don't think much of that. So you can see how, because of the geography and the spread of us in New Zealand, it might make no difference if we live in a city, but it makes a lot of difference if that's the only place you see a review.
Sure. I mean, you've been a literary critic, so you know the effect also of criticism. I mean, if it's bad, you just have to accept it gracefully, though.
We'll pretend to accept it gracefully. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Have you developed a thick skin, or you probably haven't had many bad reviews, Vincent, so you've never had to consider it?
Got an hour or two?
We'll leave out one particular stoush with a former person who's been to the Marlborough Book Festival in the past. But anyway, yes. But generally, you've had good reviews.
Yeah, I think reasonable ones. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic book. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few minutes. If there are questions from the audience, please take the opportunity to ask Vincent anything while he's here before he disappears back to Dunedin and the. I was going to make a joke at Dunedin's expense as I hear the rain pouring down on the roof. So that's not going to work, is it? But please, are there any questions from the audience in the front, madam?
Yeah, just going back to the comment that you made earlier about having to write about Africa where you haven't been. I mean, that is a debate that has been going on for quite a while about who is entitled to write about what. Men shouldn't write about woman characters.
I know.
Wives you can't write about. I mean, but that's rather limiting, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't believe it for a minute. My attitude is about any writer, write about anything you want to, and if you don't do it well, people are entitled to say so, and they don't have to agree with it or like it if you do it badly. But don't, for goodness sake, ever accept that there is something that you're not allowed to write about because you're into censorship immediately. And self-censorship is really no better than accepting it from someone else. Although, as I said, I was aware myself that if I'd written about a point of view from a Jewish point of view about the camps, I was free to do that. No one has got the right to say you shouldn't do it, but I think it would be a very foolish thing to do. Yeah. And aesthetically, quite as well as morally, I think you're letting yourself in for a fall, you're riding for a fall.
Other questions out here? Madam.
Back to the secret about Eva.
Can you hear Vincent?
About Eva?
About Eva.
Yes.
Yes, and why she committed suicide.
Mm.
Do we have to find the answer to that ourselves from reading the book? I have read the book.
Yes.
And I don't know why.
Oh, good, there's someone else
Yeah.
that didn't.
Yeah.
Other than that, clearly she was depressed.
Yeah. It's not hidden away as a puzzle.
As simple as that, or is it something that Miss McGovern or Ruth, her aunt,
They're aware of it.
yeah.
And
I mean, do I have to really...
no, you don't have to get a scalpel to find it or anything.
No, you can pop down here afterwards and ask me.
Yeah.
If you,
Yeah. Oh, no, I'd hate to think it was, you never got the right to play games, and think, this is like James Joyce's wife records that she would come into the room sometimes when he was writing Finnegan's Wake and so on, here and laughing and so on, and she'd say, what's going on? And he'd say, 100 years to work this one out. So there's nothing like that. It's just part of the story that isn't necessarily easily picked up because the other characters in the book can't refer to it because they don't know it. So we'll talk anyway on it. Yes, yeah.
Barbie.
I read your book about 6 weeks ago, and I've now bought a copy. I read it through my book club. I've now bought a copy because I feel I have to read it again. And I'm wondering, is that my fault or your fault?
If you have to read it again because you didn't know what it was about, it's my fault entirely.
Small aspects.
But if you had to
there's
read...
no excuse really to make a book more difficult than you want to. If it's a difficult story, a difficult situation, sometimes you have to. If I read a novel, for example, that's anything to do with finance and money, I have to read it again, because there are some. Obviously, the person knows a hell of a lot more about technical things. Than I do. But no, if you had to read it again because you were puzzled, no, that's my fault. But I hope it isn't. I hope other people didn't hear you say that, really.
Look, I can say it's a book that deserves at least one reading. It's a fantastic book, Vincent. Elizabeth Alley started her review of it by saying, is there anyone else like Vincent O'Sullivan? And we'll end this session by answering that by saying no, and he's unique, and we're incredibly lucky to have had him here in Marlborough for the book festival. Thanks, Vincent, and please join me in thanking him.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Vincent's going to be here for the next wee while. Please do come and see him, have a chat, and have books signed by him.